The box was not supposed to be there. Ashford's annual Forgotten Items sale, held every September in the parking lot behind the shuttered Victorian house the town could never bring itself to demolish, was usually an exercise in cheerful disorder. Card tables trembling under the weight of chipped china, rust-eaten tools, faded quilts whose patterns no one remembered. But that morning, as school librarian Evan Brooks passed the final row of tables, he noticed a carton pushed half beneath a warped sawhorse, as if someone had placed it there at the last possible second. The cardboard was soft with age, its corners feathered. A strip of handwriting, nearly erased by time, read, "Carter House, Attic Items." Evan froze. The Carter House had been abandoned for decades, shut tight even during Ashford's periodic attempts at historic preservation. The town spoke of it the way people spoke of a site touched by misfortune, softly, vaguely, as if saying too much invited whatever still lingered there. He crouched and lifted the carton. It was lighter than expected. Inside, wrapped in 2 layers of newspaper dated 1923, lay a single object, a studio portrait in a wooden frame, sealed behind glass that had opacified at the edges like a cataract. He recognized the style immediately, late 19th century, formal, meant to last. He carried it to a patch of stronger light and peeled back the brittle paper. As it fell away, the family emerged. A father seated straight-backed, one hand resting on his knee with the professional certainty of a man accustomed to authority. A woman beside him, her posture graceful yet tense, holding a lace handkerchief folded into a precise square. 3 children stood in front, a girl of about 14, eyes solemn, 2 younger boys pressed together as if sharing the same breath. Their clothing, starched collars, carefully mended hems, suggested a family with modest means but unmistakable pride. In the lower margin, delicately printed in faded ink, Carter Family, July 1899. Nothing about the image was unusual. Nothing except the stillness of it, the way each person seemed caught at a precise moment between expectation and dread. Evan turned the frame to examine the back. That was when the breath left him. Across the dry cardboard, written not in ink but in coarse strokes of charcoal, a hand, shaking, desperate, had scrawled, "All were gone before the end of 1900. No signature. No explanation. Just that sentence, pressed so hard the letters had cut faint grooves into the backing. He ran his thumb lightly over the inscription. Charcoal dust came away under his nail, as if whoever wrote it had done so in haste, with no time to revise or reconsider. The phrase, "all were gone," did not read as dramatic embellishment. It read as record. As someone forcing themselves to set down a truth no one else would. Evan looked again at the family. The father's eyes, sharp even through the photograph's sepia haze, seemed to hold a warning. The mother's handkerchief, gripped a fraction too tightly, hinted at something already frayed within the household. And the children, especially the daughter, wore expressions too serious for a summer portrait. He stood for several long minutes, the parking lot noise dissolving into a low, indistinct hum. The inscription had lodged itself inside him like a splinter. He felt it as an obligation, a summons. He paid $3 for the photograph, barely hearing the volunteer at the table. Back home, he cleared his dining table and placed the portrait at its center. Afternoon light slid across the image, illuminating the grain of the paper, the fine cracks in the varnished frame. All were gone before the end of 1900. If that were true, the photograph represented not a moment of ordinary family life, but the final recording of a lineage already in its last year. Historians in town often spoke of the 1900 winter as a difficult one, the old mill flooding the river with runoff, disease in the workers' settlement, an economic panic that shuttered half the local businesses. But no one had ever mentioned a single family completely extinguished. Evan reached for his notebook, his hand trembling slightly. He wrote a single line, who wrote the inscription, and why did no one speak of what happened to the Carters? It was a question that would lead him into dusty archives, disintegrating ledgers, and long-buried testimonies that had been quietly removed from Ashford's public memory. But tonight, as the sun lowered and shadows lengthened across the photograph, he felt only the beginning of a current, slow, heavy, inescapable, pulling him toward a truth the town had refused to exhume. The next morning, Evan returned to the photograph as if drawn by a magnetic pull. Overnight, the charcoal inscription had sunk deeper into his thoughts, refusing to release him. He opened his laptop, typed Carter Family Ashford, Maine 1899 into the digitized newspaper archive, and began the slow search through brittle pages scanned into monochrome. For nearly an hour, nothing caught his eye, until a column from September 1899 appeared under the local notices. Dr. Harold Carter addresses town council regarding mill workers' illnesses. Evan clicked it open. The article was short, squeezed between an advertisement for coal delivery and a complaint about stray dogs. But the details were unmistakable. Dr. Harold Carter had warned the council of an unknown infection worsening among the paper mill laborers, urging an inspection of the mill's drainage into the Ashford River. The council's response, printed with breezy certainty, dismissed his concerns as exaggeration harmful to the town's economic stability. Evan leaned back, heart-thudding. In the portrait, Harold Carter's posture had seemed merely formal. Now it felt like a man bracing against something he already knew would be ignored. He searched deeper. Articles from October and November repeated the same pattern: brief mentions of seasonal sickness among mill families, reports of workers collapsing on shift, assurances from management that conditions were well within acceptable standards. Each notice felt smoothed over, sanitized, intentionally vague. Then, in early January 1900, Evan found the first obituary. Grace Whitmore Carter, age 36, wife of Dr. H. Carter, declined following winter fever. Survived by 3 children. The portrait showed her only 6 months earlier. The handkerchief in her lap now felt less like a prop and more like a nervous tether. Evan printed the obituary, flattening it beside the photograph. He kept reading. By late February, a second obituary: Thomas Carter, age 16, Harold and Grace's eldest son. Cause of death: respiratory failure. The term was vague, too vague for a physician's child in a town with a reputable doctor only streets away. Evan paused, absorbing the weight of the timeline. From July 1899 to February 1900, first the workers, then the doctor's own family. The charcoal inscription's urgency echoed louder. He opened the town council minutes for that winter. The January 12th entry chilled him. Dr. Carter again insists mill runoff poses danger. Council advises cessation of further alarm. Cessation of alarm, and official silencing. A pattern was forming, one that suggested not natural sickness but institutional refusal. He searched for personal accounts. In an early March edition of the Ashford Daily Chronicle, he found a letter to the editor from an unnamed mill worker's wife: "Our men cough black. Our boys cannot sleep for want of breath. Dr. Carter is the only one who will come near our homes. Black cough. Chemical exposure, perhaps, the type concealed behind municipal reassurances." Evan's palms dampened. This was not a simple case of industrial accident. It was neglect hardened into policy. He looked again at the father's face in the photograph, eyes sharp, mouth tense. A man stepping into a battle without allies. The knowledge that his warnings had gone unheeded suddenly cast the whole portrait in a crueler light. They had stood for this picture unaware of the year ahead, unaware that the silent poison drifting through the mill's waste channels had already entered their lives. Evan clicked through the final winter and found the note he dreaded: Dr. Harold Carter withdraws from practice due to personal loss. No further explanation. No account of his warnings. Outside, evening snow began its drift across the yard, the kind that muffles the world into muted shapes. Evan felt something similar closing around him, a quietness heavy with withheld truth. The town had never spoken of this. Not in classrooms, not in recorded histories, not in any local lore. Yet the archives were clear. There had been warnings, deaths, and then silence. He turned the portrait face down, unable to meet their eyes for a moment. On the back, the charcoal inscription seemed darker in the dimming light. Before the end of 1900, someone had written, "All were gone." Now, with 2 deaths confirmed and the doctor's public collapse recorded, Evan understood that the remaining chapters would only grow more devastating. And he was committed, however deep the archives took him. Lucy Carter's name appeared only twice in the Ashford archives, and both mentions were deceptively ordinary. The first was a school honor roll from autumn 1899, a thin column praising her steadfast diligence. The second was a burial notice dated June 23, 1900. No age, no cause of death, no description of the girl she had been. Just a line break, a name, and a date. Evan stared at the burial notice for a long time. 16 years old, perhaps 14, depending on the portrait's accuracy. A child who should have had the durability of youth. Yet she was gone before midsummer. He sensed at once that Lucy would be the key. Children left traces adults did not, marginalia in schoolbooks, notes passed between friends, diaries hidden beneath loose floorboards. If anyone had recorded what truly happened inside the Carter house, he suspected it would be her. Ashford's Historical Society kept student records stacked in unlabeled bankers' boxes. Evan spent an entire Saturday sifting through them, brushing away dust thick as felt. By late afternoon, when he had almost surrendered to eye strain and stale paper, he found her handwriting. A composition book, cracked at the spine, with LC 1899 to 1900 penciled in the corner. It wasn't a diary, not openly. The first pages held copied poems, a few arithmetic exercises. But halfway through, the tone shifted. Lines slanted. Ink blotches appeared where the pen had trembled. Evan turned to the first altered page. I coughed again today. Papa asked if I slept poorly, and I lied. He is carrying too much already. I won't be another burden. A chill swept through him. This was no simple childhood unease, it was self-erasure, a girl convincing herself she must disappear quietly. It tastes like metal, she wrote 2 pages later. Not like mother's winter tonics. Something else. I washed my handkerchief before anyone saw. Evan felt the implications settle heavily. The mill runoff, its chemicals drifting through the workers' settlement, had reached the Carter household. Lucy had inhaled what the laborers breathed, perhaps through river mist, perhaps through laundry water. And she already understood enough to hide it. Further entries grew more fragmented, punctured by abrupt line breaks. Papa watches the river each time he comes home. He thinks I don't notice, but he fears it. He speaks in half-phrases, as if the water might hear. Then another, Eli asked why my dress was spotted at the collar. I told him it was ink. He believed me. He must keep believing. Ink. Evan imagined the bright, terrifying bloom of blood she had tried to conceal. Near the notebook's end, the writing faltered entirely. Mother went quickly. Tom went slowly. I am going quietly. It will be easier for Papa this way. Evan set the notebook down, throat tightening. Her reasoning was heartbreakingly clear. She feared that revealing her symptoms would destroy what remained of her father. She did not want to break him further. Yet the diary also hinted at something else, an awareness that what afflicted her was unlike the common illnesses of the time. The final entry was written in faint, unsteady strokes. Papa thinks it is consumption. It is not. The river is wrong. The water that runs from the mill foams at night. The men won't speak of it, but I have seen the barrels unloaded. The smell burns the inside of my nose. I dreamed my lungs were turning to paper. In that single line, Evan saw the tragedy's architecture unfold. The mill's waste, unregulated, unexamined, had unleashed something far more brutal than winter fevers. A toxic exposure disguised as disease. And because the town depended financially on the mill, no one dared confront it. Lucy, only 14, had understood more than the council, more than the townspeople, perhaps more even than her father. She recognized the link between the mill's barrels and her own body failing from within. He laid the notebook beside the photograph, aligning their edges. The girl in the portrait looked back with solemn eyes, as if she already sensed her fate, already bore the weight of a secret she could not speak aloud. It was nearly dusk now. Through the window, the Ashford River shimmered darkly, reflecting the lowering sky. Evan tried to imagine Lucy's last months, the quiet swallowing of symptoms, the fear of causing further grief, the determined silence as her breath thinned. Her diary explained why the death notices had been so bland. The town needed tuberculosis to remain tuberculosis. Anything else threatened the foundation of its economy. But the truth, written in a 14-year-old's cramped hand, told a darker story, not infection in the usual sense, but poisoning disguised as fate. Evan closed the notebook gently. He knew what must come next. 2 sons remained in the portrait, living through that same dreadful year. And the father, once a man who warned the council, would soon collapse beneath grief and guilt. Lucy had illuminated the pattern. Now Evan needed to trace what followed after her silence. The weeks following Lucy's death scarcely appeared in Ashford's surviving records, a silence almost deliberate in its completeness. Evan found only a brief church ledger note, the Carter girl interred. Family not present. No elaboration. No mention of who dug the grave or who lowered the small coffin into the earth. The absence itself felt like testimony. Dr. Carter, ravaged by grief, had not been capable of performing even the rituals of mourning. To understand that void, Evan turned to accounts from neighbors, preserved in private letters tucked into an attic donation decades later. Most were mundane bits of daily life, but scattered among them were glimpses of the Carter household coming undone. One note, written in an unsteady maternal script, read, "Harold Carter has scarcely been seen in daylight. The boys wander the yard alone. When spoken to, they give no clear answer. It is as if they are drifting without a tether." Another letter captured a harsher judgment. Dr. Carter, once respectable, now shuts himself indoors. His curtains remain drawn. The boys roam hungry. This cannot continue. Evan imagined the doctor, once the town's advocate, sitting motionless in his dim parlor, dawn sliding unnoticed across the floorboards. He pictured the medical instruments on his desk coated in dust, the books unopened, the coat he once wore to house visits hanging heavy with disuse. Isolation had sealed him away long before the winter storms arrived. And outside that solitude were Noah and Eli. The portrait showed the older of the 2 boys, Noah, 10, standing protectively behind his younger brother. Evan found the first trace of Noah not in official records but among school papers, a composition dated March 1900. In careful handwriting, the child wrote about hoping to see Aunt Miriam in Massachusetts when the weather warms, though the essay trailed into scribbles, as if he had grown tired or uncertain of what he was allowed to hope for. But the real revelation came from a faded envelope found among the debris catalogued after the Carter house collapsed. Inside was an unsent letter, addressed in small, determined handwriting. "Dear Aunt Miriam, Papa is not well. Eli cries at night and I try to help but I do not know how. Can we come to stay with you for a little while? I will help with chores. I can be useful. Please write back." The letter was dated April 14, 1900. Evan held the transcript with a kind of reverence, imagining Noah's quiet desperation as he wrote it. The child had understood what the adults around him could not name. The house had become unmoored from safety, its remaining structure held together by children too young to bear the weight. But the letter had never been sent. A footnote in the property cleanup report explained why. The town mailbox, shared by several houses along River Road, had been broken by a wagon accident that winter. Dr. Carter, who once petitioned the council for civic repairs, never requested its replacement. Grief had hollowed him into inaction. And so Noah's plea sat on a shelf or in a drawer, waiting for a father who no longer moved through the world. Meanwhile, small signs of neglect multiplied. A neighbor recorded hearing children arguing over stale bread. Another noted seeing Eli, 7 years old, trying to chop kindling with a blade too heavy for his hands. The boys were improvising survival in a house where the only adult had retreated into a sorrow that eclipsed responsibility. Evan felt his throat tighten as he pieced together those fragments. The Carter house, once orderly and warm, had become a place of shuttered windows, no lamp lit after dusk, no fire maintained through the cold mornings. The doctor had not collapsed suddenly, it had been a slow descent, a gradual breaking down until only the shell of him remained. A final letter, and signed, likely written by a neighbor too afraid to intervene directly, captured the moment with heartbreaking clarity. "Harold Carter walks past us as though we are ghosts. His eyes meet no one's. The boys follow him sometimes, but he does not turn to see them. The house is sinking. Someone must help before it is too late. But help never arrived. The town that had refused to listen to Dr. Carter's warnings about the mill's poison now averted its gaze from his family's suffering. To interfere would mean acknowledging the chain of neglect that had begun in months earlier. Silence, once chosen, was easier to maintain than truth. By midsummer 1900, the Carter household was no longer a home but a waning orbit slowly losing its center. Noah's unsent letter remained the clearest record of that unraveling, a small hand reaching outward into a world that offered no reply. Evan placed the transcript beside Lucy's diary and the portrait. The story was tightening now, drawing toward the inevitable collapse described in the inscription. 2 children still remained. A grieving father who no longer lived in his own body. And a town whose indifference had already set the trajectory for what came next. By early autumn of 1900, the Carter house existed in a fragile balance, 3 figures drifting through rooms where life had stalled. The garden lay untended, the fence sagged in 2 places, and the curtains hung unevenly, as if pulled by hands too small to reach the rods. Neighbors passed by without slowing, unwilling to witness what the town had helped create. No one thought to check the structural state of the old municipal water tower standing less than 100 yards away, its timbers rotting after decades of deferred maintenance. Evan discovered the first official reference to the tower in a terse council notice from 1897, inspection deferred, funds required elsewhere. A year later, structure serviceable. Repairs to be arranged when feasible. Nothing further until October 2, 1900, when the Ashford Chronicle reported a night storm of unusual severity. But the article mentioned only minor damage across River Road, omitting what truly happened. The truth emerged instead from an unpublished manuscript by a local woman, found among her granddaughter's belongings and later donated to the Historical Society. Her recollection was raw, unpolished, and painfully direct. There was a sound like a tree cracking, but deeper, as if the ground itself were splitting. Then the water tower gave out, and part of it pitched straight toward the Carter place. I heard the boys screaming. We ran from our porch, but the wind was fierce with rain, and nothing could be seen for the spray. Evan traced the event through damage assessments compiled days later. They described how one of the tower's 4 support legs had sheared off in the storm, sending thousands of gallons rushing downward in a violent cascade. The structure collapsed sideways, crushing several sheds and small dwellings before striking the Carter property. The official report listed 3 houses destroyed beyond repair, but provided no individual names. Ashford had recorded the disaster as a structural failure, not a human one. Evan suspected the truth was far more *mate and far more devastating. Among the cataloged debris recovered during the 2020's restoration project, and now stored in archival boxes, Evan found a note written by a volunteer who helped sift through the wreckage more than a century later, found remnants of medical bag under fallen beams, likely belonged to Dr. Carter. It was accompanied by a single rusted hinge and a cracked lens from a physician's ophthalmoscope. The implication was clear: Harold Carter had been inside when the tower fell. Seeking corroboration, Evan examined a coroner's book from 1900, faded but legible. One line stood out, squeezed between entries for livestock injuries: H. Carter, deceased. Blunt force trauma. Instantaneous. No further detail. No mention of surviving family. He turned to the account of the neighbor who had written the manuscript. The next paragraph described a scene of frantic, rain-blind searching. We found Noah near the edge of the yard, dazed but alive. Eli could not be found. When dawn came, his tracks were traced toward the river. There the manuscript stopped abruptly, as if the writer could not bear to continue. Another source, a letter written by a man who had served as a constable, filled in the missing piece. Evan read it slowly, the paper fragile with age. The younger boy headed toward the mill site, calling for his mother. He had no shoes. We followed the footprints until they disappeared at the river's bend. Found him at dawn by the bank, curled beneath a cedar root. Exposure. 7 years old. Lost in a storm. Seeking a place he believed might hold safety because his mother had once worked there. Evan closed his eyes. The portrait's smallest figure, Eli perched close to his siblings, now appeared unbearably vulnerable. In the photograph, his hand rested lightly against his brother's coat. That gesture now seemed prophetic, the instinct to cling to the only stability he had known. The collapse of the water tower had been presented as an accident of nature. But Evan saw the broader anatomy, decades of deferred repairs, a council unwilling to spend funds while the mill consumed every budget line, a town stretched by its own negligence. The deaths were not weather-driven misfortune but the inevitable result of choices made long before the storm arrived. One final document completed the picture, a clerical note stating that Noah Carter, age 10, was taken in by a distant relative in Massachusetts for his welfare, though no further trace of him appeared in census records thereafter. Whether he survived into adulthood remained unknown. Evan laid all the gathered fragments beside the photograph. The father, K*, led instantly beneath a collapse that could have been prevented. The youngest child, frozen in fear and river wind. The older boy, surviving but effectively vanished. It was the near-total erasure of a family by structures, literal and societal, that had failed them at every point. Only the portrait remained intact. A final moment before the year unraveled. Evan felt the weight of it settle heavily on the table, not the tragedy of a single night, but the culmination of months of unsolved grief, toxic exposure, civic apathy, and the collapse, both physical and moral, of the world surrounding the Carters. When town workers began clearing the Carter property in late autumn of 2020, preparing the site for a long-delayed memorial garden, they expected only splintered beams, rusted household metal, and the scattered remnants of a century of weathering. What they did not expect was the small, rust-bitten object discovered beneath a brick step that once led to the front porch. It was a metal box, iron, hand-soldered, warped at one corner, wedged into the soil as if someone had hidden it quickly, perhaps in the final months before the collapse. A volunteer flagged it, noting its weight and the hollow rattle within. When the Historical Society received it, they sent it directly to Evan, who by then had become the unofficial custodian of all things related to the Carter tragedy. He placed the box on his table beside the portrait, Lucy's diary, and the transcripts of Noah's letter. Even before opening it, he sensed that what lay inside would reorient the family's story. The lid required careful prying, flakes of rust came away like old scabs. When it finally loosened, the smell of damp paper and metal drifted out, a century of silence lifting. Inside, wrapped in a piece of faded muslin, were several folded sheets. Some were barely intact, their edges eaten by moisture, but the handwriting remained legible in the center of each page. Evan recognized it immediately from medical records and newspaper letters he had already examined, Dr. Harold Carter's script, precise yet increasingly unsteady. The first page was dated March 1900, shortly after Lucy's symptoms would have worsened. Evan read slowly, "To Miriam Carter, I fear we may soon need your help. The boys are well for now, but I cannot promise I will remain capable of providing for them. Ashford grows hostile. My warnings regarding the mill have set neighbors against me. Yet I write without assurance, for I cannot be certain you will welcome them." The letter had never been sent. Beneath it lay another, undated but clearly written later, the pen strokes shakier. "Some in town believe I have exaggerated the dangers. I am accused of harming Ashford's standing with my words. They whisper their suspicions to one another. I hear them. I know what they intend, the isolation of my family. Miriam, I wish to send Noah and Eli to you, but I fear your refusal after what you may have been told." The line that followed cut deeper. "If I have failed them, it is because the town has already judged me beyond redemption." Evan paused, absorbing the weight of that confession. Dr. Carter had not simply collapsed under grief, he had been pressured by a community unwilling to confront the mill's poisoning. His warnings had branded him a threat. Even his family's suffering had been recast as his own fault. Another letter, written in trembling strokes, revealed the final turn. Tonight Noah left a note on the table. "I have not yet read it. I lack the courage. If it is what I fear, a request to leave, to escape this place, I must decide whether it is safer for them to remain or go. But the roads are watched. The council wants no disruption. They would rather deny what is happening than admit the mill is *ling us. Evan felt a chill. This was likely the night Noah wrote his unsent plea for help. The father had seen the letter, but had been too consumed by fear of the town's judgment and his own unraveling to act. He lifted the final document from the box, a sheet written in a more frantic hand, ink smeared in places. I have wronged my children by staying. But I cannot flee with them, the illness lurks even here. Grace begged me to leave when she first noticed the sickened workers. I told her we were safe. I was wrong. She is gone. The others follow. If I send the boys away now, will they survive the journey? Or will I doom them to the same fate? Signed simply, H.C. The letters revealed a man caught between fear, guilt, and collapsing hope, yet still trying, however feebly, to save his children. They also exposed the town's relentless pressure, neighbors accusing him of spreading panic, council members protecting the mill, whispers growing around him like mold in a darkened room. The most devastating detail, Dr. Carter had not ignored his sons. He had planned to send them away. But every attempt to act had been tangled in doubt, interference, and the crushing belief that any relative might reject them because of the lies circulating about him. And Noah's letter, still neatly folded, showed the heartbreaking symmetry. The boy had pleaded for escape. The father had been too broken to answer. Evan set the pages down, the weight of the box heavy in his hands. This was no simple tale of paternal negligence. It was a man suffocated by a community determined to protect industry over its own citizens. His despair had not come from weakness but from being systematically cornered until every decision felt dangerous. The story was almost complete now. Only one truth remained to be uncovered: how a town's silence had become the final architect of a family's extinction. Winter arrived early the year Evan completed his research, the kind of cold that made the river contract into a dull, slow-moving mass. Snow gathered on the eaves of the historical society, softening its edges, muting the world outside. Evan worked in a small reading room lit by a single lamp, the Carter portrait propped beside him like a silent witness. Around it lay the fragments he had retrieved: Lucy's diary, Noah's letter, the doctor's confessions, and the accounts of neighbors who watched the family's undoing without intervening. Piece by piece, the shape of the truth became undeniable. The so-called infection that swept the workers' settlement in 1899 had been the result of chemical dumping from the Ashford paper mill, spent acids, pulp byproducts, and caustic compounds flushed into the river. The illness had no name then. It manifested in coughing fits, blood-tinged sputum, corroded lung tissue, chronic fatigue, and sudden respiratory failure. Workers suffered first, then their families, then those living along the river's bend, exactly where the Carters' home stood. Dr. Harold Carter had recognized the pattern almost immediately. His warnings, however, collided with the immovable interests of Ashford's leadership. The mill was the town's economic engine, the source of wages, pride, and political leverage. To acknowledge contamination would have meant lawsuits, shutdowns, and ruin. Instead, they dismissed the doctor's findings, labeling him unstable, overzealous, grief-broken even before his losses began. Evan assembled the council records, newspaper omissions, and private letters into a chronology that made the town's complicity stark. The council had buried reports, diluted testimonies, and steered public blame toward seasonal disease. Neighbors, fearful of challenging authority or losing livelihoods, allowed the Carters to be isolated, seen but unacknowledged, suffering in plain sight. Even the disaster of October 1900, the water tower collapse, was not a random act of nature but the direct result of decades of deferred maintenance, itself a byproduct of budget decisions shaped by the mill's influence. The collapsing tower struck the weakest homes first. The Carters, already diminished by grief, illness, and abandonment, were simply swept into the wreckage. The portrait's inscription, "All were gone before the end of 1900, no longer felt mysterious. It read now like an indictment from someone who had watched the entire system fail the family. Perhaps a neighbor. Perhaps a council clerk with a guilty conscience. Whoever wrote it had wanted the truth preserved, even if only in one desperate line. Evan knew he could not let that line remain the town's only memorial. He prepared a report, over 300 pages, detailing every piece of evidence. He included Lucy's final entries describing the river's wrongness, the doctor's notes revealing community pressure, Noah's desperate plea for escape, and the town's deliberate silence. When he presented his findings at the Ashford Public Forum, the room was filled with townspeople expecting something modest, perhaps a sentimental local history lecture. What they received instead was the reconstruction of a buried tragedy. Evan spoke plainly, slowly, laying the documents before them. He did not accuse with rhetoric, he let the century-old voices speak. Gasps punctuated the quiet as he read Lucy's diary. Murmurs rippled when he revealed the council's suppressed warnings. A heavy, unsettled silence followed the description of Eli's tracks ending at the riverbank. By the time he finished, the portrait at the front of the room no longer looked like an antique curiosity. It looked like a wound. The town council, modern, not the same men as 1900, listened with bowed heads. One member whispered afterward that she felt as though she had been handed the conscience of the town. Within weeks, Ashford commissioned a memorial marker. Not a plaque tucked behind shrubs, but a stone set prominently on the Carter property, in memory of Grace, Thomas, Lucy, Eli, and Harold Carter, victims of neglect, courage, and silence. May the record remain honest. On the day of the dedication, a soft snow fell, and the river, no longer toxic, long since regulated, moved quietly beside the site. Evan placed a restored 1899 portrait on a stand for the ceremony. Residents approached it slowly, studying the faces not with curiosity, but with recognition, a family lost not to fate, but to the choices of others. After the crowd dispersed, Evan remained at the marker. He felt the weight of the story settle into the landscape, no longer hidden. The past had finally been brought into full light, its grief acknowledged, its truth given form. In the quiet, he looked again at the father's face in the portrait, each line now filled with meaning. The photograph had big asterisk N as a puzzle, but it had become something larger, a reminder that history is shaped not only by acts of cruelty, but by the quieter, more corrosive force of neglect. And yet, through a century of silence, someone had kept the final message alive. All were gone before the end of 1900. Now, at last, Ashford knew why.